Neighbors laughed when she built a stone tent inside her cabin. Niels Torkelson, who had survived 8 Dakota winters, told her plainly, "A woman alone can't cut enough timber. You'll freeze, and those children will freeze with you." She had $11, 2 children, and needed 7 cords of firewood she could not cut. On January 12, 1888, the temperature dropped 60 degrees in 6 hours. But 4 months earlier, Alma Lindqvist had never stacked a single cord of firewood in her life. Her husband Eric had done all the cutting. He had felled the cottonwoods along the creek bed, bucked them into rounds, split them with a maul that weighed 8 pounds. Alma had watched him work through the spring and summer of 1887, his shirt soaked through by noon, his hands so calloused the skin looked like bark. She had carried water to him. She had never swung the axe. They had arrived in Dakota Territory in April of that year. Alma, Eric, and their 2 children. Britta was 7. Anders was 4. They filed on 160 acres in Minor County, 14 miles from the town of Howard, and they built a cabin from cottonwood logs hauled from the creek bottom, 16 feet by 20 feet. 320 square feet of packed dirt floor, a single window with oiled paper instead of glass, and a fireplace made from fieldstone and creek clay. The fireplace was the problem. Eric had built it too wide, the throat too open, the chimney too short. It drew poorly. Half the heat went straight up and out. The rest barely reached the center of the room before the draft sucked it away. Eric said he would fix it before winter. He said a lot of things he never got to do. On the 3rd of September, 1887, Eric climbed onto the sod roof of their barn to patch a section that had sagged after the August rains. The roof gave way beneath him. He fell 9 feet onto a hand plow he had left leaning against the interior wall. The plow's blade opened his thigh to the bone. He lived for 6 days. Alma kept the wound packed with clean cloth and prayed for the fever to break. It did not break. The circuit riding minister arrived on the 5th day, and Eric died the next morning, with Alma holding his hand and both children watching from the doorway. The burial cost $9. The minister took payment in cash because he had learned not to accept promises from widows on the frontier. When he rode away, Alma had $11 left, 2 children who did not understand why their father was under the dirt behind the barn, and a cabin with a fireplace that could not heat it. She did not know yet how bad the math was. She learned it 12 days later when Niels Torkelson rode onto her claim. Torkelson was 58 years old, Norwegian, and he had homesteaded in Dakota Territory since 1879. He had survived the hard winter of 1880 and 81, the winter when blizzards came every 3 days from October to April, when the railroad stopped running, when families burned furniture, and then floorboards, and then the walls of their own homes to stay alive. His first wife had died that winter, not from cold directly, from pneumonia after the cold had weakened her lungs beyond recovery. He had remarried. He had rebuilt. He had watched other families fail and freeze and flee. When he heard about the Swedish widow whose husband had fallen through a barn roof, he rode 14 miles to assess the situation. It was what neighbors did on the frontier, even when the news they carried was bad. He walked the perimeter of the Lindqvist cabin. He examined the chinking between the logs, loose in places, gaps wide enough to slip a finger through. He crouched in front of the fireplace and looked up the chimney, then shook his head. He walked to the woodpile behind the cabin. A quarter cord, maybe less. Split cottonwood, half of it still green. Alma stood in the doorway with her arms crossed, watching him count and calculate. She already knew what he was going to say. She had been doing her own calculations every night since Eric died, scratching numbers in the dirt floor with a stick, erasing them, starting over, hoping the answer would change. It never changed. That fireplace, Torkelson said, gesturing toward the cabin. "It'll eat a cord a week, maybe more if we get a bad one." He looked at the woodpile. "You've got a quarter cord stacked, maybe a third." "I know," Alma said. "A full winter is 20 weeks. That's 5 cords minimum if the fireplace worked right. Yours doesn't. You'll need 7, maybe 8 to be safe." He paused. "A man working alone, doing nothing else, can cut 4 cords before freeze up. 5 if he's strong and the timber's close. You've got 2 children. Animals to tend, water to haul. You can't do it." "What should I do?" Torkelson looked at her for a long moment. He was not a cruel man. He had seen too many families die to take pleasure in delivering verdicts. But he had also seen what happened to people who refused to accept reality on the frontier. "Sell the claim," he said. "Take the children back to Minnesota, Wisconsin, wherever you've got family. There's no shame in it. Half the women who lose husbands out here do the same." He mounted his horse. "The ones who don't." He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. Alma watched him ride away until he was a dark speck against the yellow grass. Then she went inside and looked at Britta and Anders, who were sitting at the table eating cold cornmeal mush, and she tried to imagine telling them they were leaving, that their father was dead and buried, and now they had to abandon the land he had died trying to work. She could not imagine it, but she could not imagine surviving the winter either. That night, after the children were asleep, Alma scratched the numbers in the dirt one more time. 7 cords needed, a quarter cord stacked, 17 weeks until the ground froze too hard to work. Even if she did nothing but cut wood from dawn to dark, she might manage 3 cords. Maybe 3.5 if she pushed until her body broke. 3 cords was not 7 cords. The gap was 4 cords of wood, roughly 400 cubic feet of split timber, roughly 12,000 pounds. She could not close the gap. No one could. She erased the numbers and went to bed. But she did not sleep. The answer did not come from calculation. It came from a water bucket. 3 weeks after Torkelson's visit, in late September, Alma was hauling water from the creek when she passed the Kaufman homestead 3 miles east. She had passed it before, dozens of times, but she had never really looked at it. The Kaufmans were German-Russians, Mennonites who had come from somewhere near the Black Sea in 1876. They kept to themselves. They spoke English poorly. Their farm looked strange, not like the other homesteads in the county. Today Alma looked. The Kaufman house had walls nearly 3 feet thick. They were made of something that looked like oversized mud bricks, grayish-brown, with bits of straw poking through. The house itself was low and squat, built into a slight rise in the land, with a covered porch at the entrance that formed a kind of wind trap. Old Mrs. Kaufman, Gerda, 67 years old, white hair pulled back tight, was sitting outside despite the cool morning air. She was knitting something from rough gray wool. When she saw Alma staring, she did not look away. She nodded once. "You want to see?" Mrs. Kaufman asked. Her English came out thick, consonants hard. Alma hesitated. She barely knew these people. But something about the house, the thickness of the walls, the way it seemed to crouch against the earth, made her curious. She set down her water buckets and walked toward the door. Inside, the Kaufman house was warmer than any building Alma had ever entered on the frontier. Not just warm, evenly warm. No cold drafts from the corners, no chill creeping up from the floor. The air itself felt different, still and heavy, like the air in a root cellar. In the center of the main room stood something Alma did not recognize. It looked like a massive brick box, maybe 4 feet wide and 6 feet tall, plastered smooth and painted with white lime wash. A metal door on one side suggested a firebox, but there was no fire burning, no smoke, no sound of crackling wood. yet heat radiated from the surface. Alma could feel it from 3 feet away. "You touch," Mrs. Kaufman said. She was smiling now, pleased to show off something from the old country. "It's warm. Go. Touch." Alma pressed her palm against the white plaster. It was warm, not hot, not burning, but warm like skin, like a living thing. She pulled her hand back and stared. "No fire," she said. "How is it warm with no fire?" Mrs. Kaufman laughed. "Fire this morning. 1 hour. Fire tonight. 1 hour. Stone." She patted the heater like a favorite animal. "Stone remembers. Holds the warm. Let's go slow." She explained, halting and broken, what Alma was looking at. A Russian stove, they called it, though the design was older than Russia itself. They had built these in the old country for generations, in villages along the Dnieper and the Black Sea, where winters were long and wood was precious. The principle was simple. Build a massive core of brick or stone, run the smoke through winding channels inside it, and let the masonry absorb the heat. A brief hot fire, 1 hour in the morning, 1 hour at night, could warm the stone enough to radiate heat for 12 hours or more. "American fireplace," Mrs. Kaufman said, shaking her head. "Waste, burns, burns, burns. Heat goes." She pointed up, toward the ceiling, toward the sky. "Away. This," she patted the stove again, "keeps." Alma stood in the warm room and felt something shift inside her chest. Not hope, not yet, but something adjacent to hope. A door opening in a wall she had thought was solid. "How much wood?" she asked. "For winter?" Mrs. Kaufman held up 2 fingers. 2 cord, maybe less. 2 cords, not 7, not 5. 2. Alma walked home with her water buckets and her thoughts racing. She could not build a Russian stove. She had no brick, no lime, no knowledge of the winding channels that made the design work. The Kaufmans had brought their stove mason with them from the old country. Alma had only herself. But she could not stop thinking about the principle, the heat trapped in stone, the small space, evenly warm, the walls 3 feet thick, holding everything in. That night, she did not scratch numbers in the dirt. She scratched shapes, rectangles inside rectangles, walls within walls. The idea came together over 3 sleepless nights. She could not build a Russian stove, but she could build walls. She could reduce the space she needed to heat. Her cabin was 16 by 20 feet, 320 square feet. The fireplace could not heat it. Torkelson was right about that. Even with 7 cords of wood, even with a fire burning day and night, the drafts would steal the warmth faster than the fireplace could produce it. The corners would hover near freezing. The floor would frost over. The children would sleep under every blanket they owned and still wake up shivering. But what if she did not try to heat the whole cabin? What if she built a smaller room inside it? She scratched the dimensions in the dirt. 8 feet by 8 feet, 64 square feet, 1/5 the cabin's volume. If the fireplace could heat 320 square feet to 35 degrees, it could heat 64 square feet to... She did not know the exact number, but it had to be higher. 50 degrees, maybe 60. The walls would be stone. Fieldstone from the creek bed, the same stone Eric had used for the fireplace. She would stack it thick, 18 inches at the base, maybe a foot at the top, and pack the gaps with mud mortar mixed from creek clay and slough grass. The stone would do what the Kaufman stove did, absorb heat when the fire was burning, release it slowly when the fire died. Between the stone walls and the cabin walls, she would stuff hay. Insulation. The cabin's logs would block the wind. The hay would trap air. The stone would hold heat. 3 layers between her children and the cold. She could seal the top with boards. She knew where to find some. A collapsed soddy 3 miles west that nobody had claimed, and pile sod on top for insulation. She would leave a gap near the chimney for smoke to escape. The fireplace would still be inefficient, but it would be heating 64 square feet instead of 320. The stone would store heat instead of letting it escape. The reduced volume might be survivable on the wood she could actually cut. It was not a certain plan. It was barely a plan at all. But the conventional path guaranteed death. This path only risked it. Clara Pedersen arrived 3 days later. Word traveled fast among the scattered homesteads, even when the news was strange. Clara was 34, Norwegian, a widow twice over. Her first husband had died of something in his chest 4 years back. She had remarried within 6 months. You had to, on the frontier, if you wanted to survive. And then her second husband died of typhoid in '86. She ran her claim alone now, 2 miles north, and she had earned a reputation as someone who did not waste time on foolishness. She found Alma outside the cabin, scratching lines in the dirt with a stick. "I heard a strange story," Clara said. "Someone said you were drawing pictures in the ground. Building plans, they said, for a room inside your room." Alma did not look up. "It's not a room. It's a stone enclosure, 8 by 8, around the fireplace." "Stone walls, inside your own cabin." Clara's brow furrowed. She walked around the scratched lines, studying them like a surveyor examining bad terrain. "Where will you sleep? Where will the children sleep? You'll have no space to move." "We'll have heat." "You don't know that. You've never built anything like this." "Nobody has." Clara crouched down, her practical face intent. "And while you're stacking stones, you're not cutting wood. You're not banking the cabin. You're not storing food for the cellar. You're gambling everything on an idea from a German woman who doesn't speak English." "She speaks enough," Alma said. "This is madness. You know that." Clara stood up and brushed dirt from her skirt. "If this doesn't work, if you spend 3 weeks building a stone box and it doesn't hold heat, you'll have nothing. No woodcut, no backup. You'll be worse off than if you'd done nothing at all." Alma finally looked up. "If I do nothing at all, I need 7 cords. I can cut 3, maybe 3.5. She gestured at the lines in the dirt. "If this works, I need 2 cords, maybe 3. The math changes." "The math might change, or you might freeze to death in a stone box of your own making." Clara shook her head. "I hope you know what you're doing." She left without saying goodbye. Alma watched her go, then looked down at the lines in the dirt. 8 feet by 8 feet, 18 inches thick at the base. She started hauling stone the next morning. The work nearly killed her. The creek bed lay half a mile from the cabin, down a slope thick with switchgrass, and across a boggy stretch that sucked at her boots with every step. The fieldstone she needed, flat-faced rocks, heavy and dense, the kind that would hold heat, were buried in the mud along the banks. She had to dig them out with her hands, pry them loose from the muck, carry them one by one back up the slope. Each stone weighed between 30 and 60 pounds. The good ones, the flat ones, the ones that would stack cleanly, were usually the heaviest. She could carry 1 stone per trip, 2 trips per hour if she did not rest, 10 stones per day if she pushed herself to the edge of collapse. By the 3rd day, her back felt like someone had driven a railroad spike between her shoulder blades. By the 5th day, her hands were so blistered that blood soaked through the rags she wrapped around her palms. By the 8th day, she had lost count of the trips, lost count of the stones, lost count of everything except the wall rising slowly in the corner of her cabin. Britta helped. She was only 7, but she could carry the smaller stones, 10 pounds, 15, in her apron. She made the half-mile walk with her mother, picked through the creek bed for rocks she could lift, and carried them back without complaint. Her hands blistered too. Alma wrapped them in strips of an old petticoat and told her she was brave. Anders was too young to carry stone. but he helped with the mortar. Creek clay mixed with slough grass and water, stirred with a stick until it reached the consistency of thick porridge. He stirred until his arms ached, then stirred some more. He asked why they were building a wall inside their house. Alma told him it would keep them warm. He accepted this and kept stirring. The wall grew slowly, 12 inches high by the end of the first week, 18 inches by the middle of the second. The stones were irregular, mismatched, nothing like the smooth bricks of Mrs. Kaufman's stove. Alma had to fit them together like puzzle pieces, filling gaps with mud, shimming uneven surfaces with smaller rocks wedged into place. On the 15th day, the third wall collapsed. She had stacked it too fast, not waiting for the mortar to cure. The weight of the upper courses pushed outward, and in the middle of the night, she woke to a grinding roar as 200 pounds of fieldstone slumped into a pile on the cabin floor. Alma sat in the darkness, listening to Britta and Anders crying in their bed, and felt something inside her crack. Not break, not yet, but crack, like ice on a pond in early spring. She rebuilt the wall. It took 2 days. She stacked more slowly this time, letting each course dry before adding the next. She lost 2 days she did not have. October 10th brought the first frost. Alma woke to find ice on the water pail. Thin ice. Easy to break with a finger, but ice nonetheless. The ground would start hardening soon. Once it froze solid, hauling stone would become impossible. The mortar would not cure. The window for building would slam shut. She worked faster. She worked until her vision blurred and her legs gave out. She worked until Britta had to bring her dinner to the cabin because she could not stop long enough to walk to the house. 3 walls done by day 18. 4th wall done by day 23. The structure rose inside the cabin like a malformed growth. 8 feet by 8 feet, 6 feet tall at the center, stone walls tapering from 18 inches at the base to 12 inches at the top. It smelled like a root cellar and looked like nothing she had ever seen. The roof came next. She traded 2 chickens to a German farmer 3 miles west for permission to salvage boards from his collapsed soddy. She hauled the boards back on a makeshift travois, split and weathered planks that had once been someone else's ceiling. She laid them across the top of the stone structure, overlapping the gaps, and piled sod on top for insulation. She left a hole near the chimney where smoke could escape. The door was a blanket. Heavy wool, doubled over, nailed to a frame of salvaged lumber. It would not keep out a determined draft, but it would slow the heat loss enough to matter. On October 24th, the first snow flurries swirled across the claim. The ground was starting to freeze, but the structure was done. Clara Pedersen returned on October 26th. She stood in the cabin doorway and stared at the stone enclosure that now occupied nearly half the interior space. The hearth of the old fireplace opened into it. The rest of the cabin, the table, the chairs, the children's bed, was now cut off, separated by 18 inches of fieldstone and mud. "It looks like a tomb," Clara said. "It's not a tomb." Alma was sitting inside the enclosure, her back against the warm stone. She had built a small fire that morning, a test just to see, and the walls had absorbed the heat. Hours later, they were still faintly warm to the touch. "Feel the wall." Clara stepped inside, ducking through the blanket door. She pressed her palm against the stone and held it there. Her expression shifted, not to belief, not yet, but to something less certain than skepticism. "Warm," she admitted. "But it's October. Wait until January. Wait until it's 30 below and the wind is blowing through every crack in this cabin. Then we'll see if your stone box keeps you breathing." She was right. Alma knew she was right. This had been a test at 35 degrees above zero, not 35 below. The real Dakota winter had not arrived, but the structure was done. The walls were up. The roof was sealed. She had cut 1.5 cords of wood during construction. Not enough, not nearly enough, but more than nothing. She had 2 cords total now, stacked against the cabin's east wall. 2 cords. She needed 3, maybe 2.5 if the winter was mild. The winter would not be mild. She knew this the way she knew her own name. But she had done what she could do. The rest was up to the stone and the fire and whatever mercy existed in a Dakota January. Clara left without offering encouragement. She did not believe the stone tent would work, but she no longer said so out loud. Harlan Briggs came 2 days later. Briggs was 41 years old, a land speculator from Ohio who had arrived in Dakota Territory in 1883 with cash and an eye for opportunity. He ran the general store in Howard, but his real business was buying failed claims. When a homesteader died or fled, the county auctioned the land for back taxes. Briggs was usually the only bidder. He had acquired 3 claims this way during the hard winter of 80 and 81, buying them for a fraction of their value and reselling them to new arrivals the following spring. He had visited Alma once before, 2 weeks after Eric's funeral, with an offer of $40 for the claim. She had refused. Now he was back, and his offer had dropped. $30, he said. He did not dismount from his horse. He looked down at her from the saddle, his face arranged in an expression of concerned benevolence that did not reach his eyes. It's less than before, I know, but I hear you've been doing strange things, building projects, wasting time. The situation has changed. The situation hasn't changed, Alma said. I'm not selling. Briggs laughed. Not a cruel laugh. He was too smooth for cruelty, but an amused laugh, the kind a grown man might give a child who claimed she could fly. Mrs. Lindqvist, I've seen what you've built in there. A stone tent, they're calling it. A box of rocks inside your own cabin. He shook his head. That's not survival. That's a woman who's lost her mind from grief. And I understand I do. Losing a husband out here, alone, with 2 young children. It does things to people, but the grief won't keep you warm when January comes. The stone will keep me warm. The stone will keep your body cold until spring. He leaned forward in the saddle. I'll make it 35. That's my final offer. Enough to get you and the children back to wherever you came from. Enough to start over somewhere with a real roof and a real stove and people who can help. I don't need help. You don't need help. He repeated it flatly, as if testing the words for truth. A widow? 2 children. 2 cords of wood when you need 7. A fireplace that couldn't warm a closet. And a pile of rocks in the corner that you think will save you. He gathered his reins. When I'm standing at the auction next spring, buying this claim for back taxes, I want you to remember something. I tried to help. I offered you a way out. You chose to stay and freeze. He rode away without looking back. Alma watched him go, her jaw tight, her hands clenched at her sides. She went inside and looked at the stone structure. Her tomb, Clara had called it. Her pile of rocks, Briggs had said. The walls were still faintly warm from the morning's test fire. She pressed her palm against them and felt the heat stored in the stone, patient and slow, waiting to be released. 3 weeks until the first true cold. 2 cords of wood, 2 children sleeping in the corner. She added another log to the fire and watched the flames climb. November came in cold. The temperature dropped to 10 degrees on the 3rd, then 0 on the 7th, then 5 below on the 12th. The stone tent was tested for the first time under real conditions, and Alma watched the numbers like a gambler watching cards. Morning temperature inside the stone enclosure, 38 degrees. Cold, miserably cold, but above freezing. She could see her breath when she woke, hanging in the air like a ghost, but the water bucket had not frozen. The walls still held faint warmth from the night's last fire. Morning temperature in the outer cabin, beyond the stone walls, 14 degrees. The water bucket out there had frozen solid. Frost coated the inside of the window, thick enough to scrape with a fingernail. The difference was 24 degrees. The stone tent was holding heat. She kept records. Every morning she pressed her palm against the wall and estimated the temperature. Every night she counted the wood she burned. The numbers were not what she had hoped. She was using more fuel than Mrs. Kaufman's stove would have required, but they were better than the fireplace alone would have demanded. At this rate, she would run out of wood in late February, maybe early March. She needed to find more fuel. But that was a problem for later. For now, the stone was working. The children were warm enough. They were alive. Niels Torkelson rode onto the claim in the first week of December. He had heard the stories. Everyone had heard the stories about the widow who built a stone room inside her cabin. He had expected to find a desperate woman in a collapsing structure, burning furniture to stay alive. Instead, he found smoke rising from the chimney, children playing near the barn, and a cabin that looked no different from the outside than it had in September. Alma met him at the door. She did not invite him inside. She waited to see what he had come to say. Torkelson was quiet for a long moment. He was remembering perhaps what he had told her in September, the verdict he had delivered, the death he had predicted. "I heard you built something," he said finally. "Something with stone walls. A stone enclosure around the fireplace, 8 feet by 8. Does it work?" "So far." He nodded slowly. "October and November are nothing. December's cold but short. January is when people die." He looked at the sky, gray and heavy with the promise of snow. "We haven't had a bad one yet this winter. When we do—" "I know," Alma said. "When we do, I'll find out if it works." Torkelson studied her for a moment. His expression was difficult to read. Not admiration, not yet, but something adjacent to it. Grudging acknowledgement, perhaps. The recognition that she had done something unexpected, something he had not thought possible. "You might make it," he said. "If it stays mild." He gathered his reins. "It won't stay mild, but you might make it anyway." He rode away without saying more. Alma watched him go, then went back inside, where the stone walls waited and the fire burned low and steady, and the children slept in the warmth she had built with her own hands. 2 cords of wood remained, 7 weeks until the end of January. The real test had not come yet, but it was coming. She could feel it in the air, in the weight of the gray sky, in the stillness that settled over the prairie like a held breath. Winter was only beginning. Christmas came and went without celebration. Alma had nothing to give the children except warmth, and even that she rationed. One fire in the morning, built hot and fast, then allowed to burn down to coals. One fire in the evening, the same. Between them, the stone released its stored heat slowly, grudgingly, like a miser parting with coins. The temperature outside dropped to 15 below zero on Christmas Eve. Inside the stone tent, it held at 34 degrees through the night, cold enough to see your breath. Cold enough that the children slept in all their clothes, under every quilt they owned, pressed together like puppies in a litter. But not cold enough to kill. December's woodpile shrank, 1.5 cords remaining on New Year's Day, 1 cord and a quarter by the 10th of January. Alma started burning less. She let the morning fire die earlier. The evening fire burned shorter. The interior temperature dropped, 31 degrees, 29, 27 on the coldest mornings. Anders woke up crying that his fingers hurt. Britta stopped talking in the mornings, saving her energy for warmth, but they were alive. The water bucket inside the stone tent never froze solid. The outer cabin, beyond the stone walls, stayed locked in permanent winter, frost on every surface, ice thick enough to walk on in the corners where moisture pooled, but the stone tent held. 1 cord of wood left. 5 weeks until March. The math was still brutal, but it was survivable math. If nothing went wrong, if the winter stayed merely terrible instead of catastrophic. The winter did not stay merely terrible. January 12th, 1888 began with fog. Alma woke before dawn to a strange mildness in the air. The temperature had climbed overnight. She could feel it through the stone walls, the absence of the usual bitter cold. When she pushed aside the blanket door and stepped into the outer cabin, she found the frost on the window had melted into droplets of water running down the oiled paper. She opened the cabin door. The air outside was warm, not spring warm, but January in Dakota warm, which meant somewhere above freezing. Fog hung over the prairie, thick and gray, muffling sound and distance. She could not see the barn 40 feet away. By mid-morning, the fog had burned off and the temperature had climbed to the mid-30s. By noon, it was above 40 degrees. The snow that had crusted the ground for weeks began to soften and darken with melt. Anders had been coughing for 3 days, a dry, barking cough that rattled in his chest and woke him at night. Alma had dosed him with honey and kept him inside the stone tent, near the warmth, hoping the cough would pass. It had not passed. This morning, his forehead was hot to the touch. Britta needed to go to school. She had missed 2 weeks already. The cold had been too severe to make the 2-mile walk, and the teacher had sent word that students who missed too many days would have to repeat the term. Alma looked at the mild morning, the melting snow, the impossible warmth of a January day that felt like April, and she made a decision she would replay in her mind for the rest of her life. "Go," she told Britta. "The weather is good. You can make it there and back before dark." Britta put on her coat. She did not need it buttoned. The air was so warm, and walked out into the fog-softened morning. Alma watched her until she disappeared over the first rise, a small figure against the yellow-gray grass, heading toward the schoolhouse 2 miles east. Then she went back inside to tend to Anders, whose cough had worsened and whose fever was climbing. The sky changed at 2 o'clock. Alma was pressing a damp cloth to Anders's forehead when she happened to glance at the window. The light had shifted, darkened, in a way that made no sense for early afternoon. She crossed to the cabin door and opened it. The northwestern horizon had vanished. In its place was a wall of black cloud, dense and churning, stretching from the ground to the top of the sky. It was moving toward her faster than any storm she had ever seen, faster than a horse could run, faster than thought. She had perhaps 5 minutes before it arrived. Britta was 2 miles away at the schoolhouse, with no coat heavy enough for what was coming. Anders was burning with fever in the stone tent, too sick to move. The livestock were in the barn, unfed, unwatered since morning. 5 minutes. Alma ran to the barn. She threw open the door, tossed hay into the stalls, broke the ice on the water trough, and ran back to the cabin. The wind hit her before she reached the door, a wall of frozen air that drove the breath from her lungs and stung her exposed skin like 1,000 needles. The temperature had been 44 degrees 10 minutes ago. Now it was below 20 and falling. She made it inside. She pulled the cabin door shut and braced it with the iron bar. She ducked through the blanket into the stone tent, where Anders lay shivering beneath the quilts, and she began to build a fire with hands that shook so badly she could barely grip the kindling. The wind screamed. The cabin walls groaned. Snow began to drive through every crack and gap in the logs, accumulating in thin white lines on the floor. Beyond the blanket door, the outer cabin temperature plummeted 10 degrees, 0, 10 below, 20 below, as if the air itself were freezing solid. Inside the stone tent, Alma fed the fire and watched the thermometer she had hung on the wall. 42 degrees, 39, 36. The stone walls began to absorb the heat from the flames. Slowly, too slowly, the temperature stabilized. 34 degrees, 33. Anders coughed and cried and called for his sister. Alma held him and watched the fire and listened to the wind trying to tear the roof off the cabin, and she thought about Britta 2 miles away in a schoolhouse with God knew how much wood and a teacher she had never met, and she understood that there was nothing she could do. She could not save both her children by leaving. She would die in the whiteout before she made it a quarter mile, and then Anders would die alone, sick and burning with fever, in a stone tent that would grow cold without anyone to feed the fire. She had to trust the teacher. She had to trust that Britta was inside, that the schoolhouse had wood, that someone would keep her daughter alive through the night. She had no other choice. The night lasted forever. The temperature outside dropped past 30 below zero by 9 o'clock, past 40 below by midnight. The wind did not stop. It came in waves, each gust stronger than the last, driving snow through cracks Alma had thought she had sealed, piling drifts against the cabin walls, burying the world in white. Inside the stone tent, Alma burned everything she could burn. The last cord of wood went first. She fed it to the fire in careful handfuls, trying to stretch it, trying to make each log last as long as possible. When the woodpile ran out sometime around 11, though she had lost track of time, she started burning other things. A broken chair that had belonged to Eric, a crate that had held their dishes during the journey west, the handle of a shovel, the frame of a mirror, a stack of old newspapers she had saved for insulation. The stone walls glowed faintly in the firelight, radiating the heat they had absorbed. When the fire burned low, the walls kept the space warm, 34 degrees, 32, 30, while Alma scrambled to find more fuel. When she fed the fire again, the walls absorbed the new heat, storing it, releasing it slowly into the air. The system worked. Even now, even at 40 below zero, with the wind screaming and the fuel running out, the system worked. Anders's fever spiked at 2 in the morning. His skin was so hot Alma could feel it through the quilts. He thrashed and murmured, calling out names, his father's name, his sister's name, words in Swedish that Alma had not taught him, words he must have heard from Eric, and she held him down and pressed cool cloths to his forehead and prayed to a god she was no longer sure existed. At 3 in the morning, the fire burned down to coals, and she had nothing left to feed it. The chair was ash. The crate was ash. She had burned every piece of wood and furniture in the stone tent except the frame of the bed the children slept on. She looked at the bed frame. Oak, solid, built by Eric in the first weeks after their arrival. It would burn for hours. She did not burn it. Not yet. Instead, she wrapped herself around Anders, adding her body heat to the quilts and the fading warmth of the stone, and she watched the coals dim and the temperature drop, 31 degrees, 30, 29, and she waited. 28 degrees at 4 in the morning, 27 degrees at 5, 26 degrees at 6 with the first gray light of dawn seeping through the cracks in the cabin walls and the wind finally beginning to die. Anders was still breathing. His fever had broken sometime in the night, sweat soaking through his nightshirt, and now he slept with his face pressed against her chest, his breath shallow but steady. 26 degrees, below freezing, but not by much, and the sun was rising. Alma crawled out of the stone tent at 7 in the morning. The outer cabin was a ruin of snow and ice. Drifts had piled through the gaps in the walls, covering the floor in white. The water bucket had frozen solid, the ice cracked from expansion. Frost coated every surface, the table, the chairs, the walls themselves, thick and white, like the inside of an ice house. The temperature in the outer cabin was 4 degrees below zero, warmer than outside, where the thermometer she kept nailed to the porch post read 31 below, but cold enough to kill anyone who tried to sleep there. The stone tent had held at 26 degrees when the outside air was 31 below, a difference of 57 degrees. The stone walls had absorbed enough heat during the evening fire to radiate warmth for hours after the fuel ran out, keeping the space above the point where flesh froze, keeping her son alive through the worst night in Dakota Territory history. Alma stood in the ruined cabin and began to laugh. It was not a happy sound. It was the sound of a woman who had bet everything on a pile of rocks and mud and discovered, against all reason, that the bet had paid off. Then she remembered Britta, and the laughter stopped. She could not reach the schoolhouse. The snow had drifted to the height of a man in places, and the cold was still lethal, 30 below zero, dropping further as the clear sky allowed the Earth's heat to escape into space. She would die before she made it half a mile. She stood in the cabin doorway, wrapped in every piece of clothing she owned, and stared at the white expanse that had swallowed the world. Somewhere out there, 2 miles to the east, her daughter was alive or dead, warm or frozen, and Alma could not reach her. An hour passed. The sun climbed higher. The temperature began to rise, 25 below, 20, 15, as the day warmed towards something that might eventually be survivable. At 9 in the morning, Alma saw movement on the horizon, a line of dark shapes, small against the white, moving slowly toward the scattered homesteads. She shaded her eyes against the glare and counted. 10 shapes, 12, 14. Small shapes, child-sized shapes, and one larger figure at the front, leading them. Alma began to run. The teacher's name was Harold Swenson. He was 22 years old, from Minnesota, in his first year teaching at the one-room schoolhouse that served the families scattered across 20 square miles of Minor County. When the storm hit, he had made a choice that saved 11 lives. He had kept the children inside. The schoolhouse had a cast-iron stove and a woodpile stacked against the wall. When the wood ran out, sometime around midnight, Swenson had started burning desks. He had torn apart the furniture with his bare hands, fed it to the fire piece by piece, and told the children to huddle together in the corner farthest from the door. Body heat, he told Alma later, when he delivered Britta to the cabin door. His hands were wrapped in rags, the skin beneath blistered and raw from handling frozen wood. 11 children pressed together generate enough warmth to make a difference. I learned that from my father. He survived a blizzard in '67 by sheltering with his horses. Britta was alive. Frost nipped on her fingers and toes. She would lose no flesh, but the skin would peel and ache for weeks, but alive. She had spent the night pressed between 2 older girls, sharing warmth, listening to the wind scream and the teacher feed desks to the fire, and she had not cried once. "She's brave," Swenson said. She told the younger children stories, kept them calm. He looked at the stone structure visible through the cabin door. She told them about the stone tent, said her mother built it to keep them warm. Alma held her daughter and did not speak. There were no words for what she felt. Relief and terror and gratitude and rage all tangled together, all fighting for space in her chest. Anders came to the blanket door, wrapped in a quilt, his fever broken but his body weak. Britta ran to him and wrapped her arms around his shoulders, and the 2 children stood together in the doorway of the stone tent their mother had built, alive and whole, while outside the temperature climbed toward 0 and the sun turned the snow into diamonds. The death toll came in slowly over the following days and weeks. 235 dead across Dakota Territory, Nebraska, and Minnesota. Some estimates ran higher, 400, 500, because not every body was found, Not every family had neighbors close enough to notice when the smoke stopped rising from the chimney. 213 of the confirmed dead were children. Students caught between home and school, teenagers sent to check on livestock, infants whose parents could not keep the cabin warm enough to sustain them. The storm had come so fast, dropped the temperature so far, that people died within yards of their own doors, unable to find the way in the whiteout. Farmer Ole Olesen Thailand, 70 years old, had gone out to check his cows near Brookings. He died 12 feet from his front door, unable to find it in the storm. Teacher Lois Royce in Plainview, Nebraska, had tried to lead her 3 students 82 yards to her boarding house. The children died in the snow. Royce survived, but both her feet were later amputated. Teacher Etta Shattuck, 19, had burrowed into a haystack with her students and waited. She survived 78 hours before rescue. Both her legs were amputated. She died 3 weeks later. And in Minor County, Dakota Territory, a widow named Alma Lindqvist had spent the night in a stone enclosure she had built with her own hands, burning furniture to keep her 5-year-old son alive, while her daughter sheltered 2 miles away with a teacher who burned desks rather than let his students freeze. All 12 of the children in that schoolhouse survived. Both of Alma's children survived. The stone tent had held. Niels Torkelson returned on January 17th. He brought a gift, half a cord of wood, loaded on a sledge and dragged behind his horse. He did not mention his September prediction. He did not say he was sorry. He simply unloaded the wood beside the cabin, stacking it carefully against the wall where the snow had not drifted, and then he asked to see the stone enclosure. Alma led him inside. Torkelson walked slowly around the small space, touching the walls, measuring with his eyes. The stone was cold now. The fire had been out for hours, but it still held a faint residual warmth, a memory of heat stored deep in the rock. "I lost my first wife to cold," Torkelson said. He was not looking at Alma. He was looking at the wall, at the rough fieldstone, and the mud mortar packed between. "We had a big cabin, good stove, plenty of wood, but the cold got in anyway. It always gets in." He put his hand flat against the stone. "Maybe it doesn't have to." He asked her to explain the construction, how thick the walls were, 18 inches at the base, 12 at the top, how she had stuffed hay into the cavity between the stone and the cabin walls, how the sod roof trapped heat rising from the fire. He took notes on a scrap of paper, his handwriting cramped and careful. When he left, he shook her hand, a gesture he had never made before, a gesture reserved for men who had earned respect. "You might make it through this winter after all," he said. "I already made it through the worst night." "No," Torkelson shook his head. "There's more winter to come, 6 weeks at least. But you've got a chance now, more than I gave you in September." He mounted his horse. "I was wrong, it happens. Not often, but it happens." He rode away without looking back. Alma watched him go, then turned to the half cord of wood he had brought, enough to last 3 weeks if she was careful, and she began stacking it against the wall. Clara Pedersen arrived the next day. She brought nothing except herself, no trade goods, no practical excuse. She stood in the doorway of the stone tent and looked at the walls that had held through the worst night in 30 years, and she did not say a word for a long time. "I thought you were building a coffin," she said finally. "I thought you'd lost your mind from grief, and you were building a box to die in." She stepped inside, ran her hand along the stone, felt the faint warmth still radiating from the surface. "Instead, you built something that works." "It's not perfect," Alma said. "It's not a proper Russian stove. The heat bleeds out too fast. I burned everything I owned to get through that night." "But you got through it." "I got through it." Clara nodded slowly. She was thinking. Alma could see it in her face, running calculations, imagining walls rising in her own cabin, her own space shrinking to something manageable. "Show me," Claire said. "Show me how to build one." By the end of that winter, 4 households in Minor County had built some version of the interior stone enclosure. Clara Pedersen finished hers in late January, during a brief thaw that softened the ground enough to haul stone. She used sod instead of fieldstone, easier to cut, easier to stack, and her walls were thinner, but the principle was the same. Reduce the volume, add thermal mass, survive on less. The Schulze family, whose patriarch had lost 3 toes to frostbite on the night of January 12th, tore out half their cabin's interior and built a stone hearth room that took up a quarter of the space. They heated it with half the wood they had used before. 2 other families followed, names Alma did not know well, homesteaders from the far edge of the county who had heard the stories and come to see for themselves. She showed them the construction, drew diagrams in the dirt, explained the mortar mix and the insulation method and the dimensions that worked. She never asked for payment. When people offered, she told them she had needed help once and someone had given it freely, and she was only passing along what she had received. Harlan Briggs did not return. The claim he had hoped to buy at auction remained in Alma's possession, worked by Alma's hands, warmed by Alma's stone. She saw him once in Howard, buying supplies at his own store. He looked at her and looked away, and that was all. The winter of 1888 did not end with the January blizzard. More storms came. February was brutal, March only slightly less so, and the stone tent was tested again and again. It held. The walls absorbed heat during the day, released it through the night, and the small space stayed warm enough to sustain life while the outer cabin froze solid around it. Anders recovered fully by February. His cough lingered for weeks, but the fever did not return. Britta's frost-nipped fingers healed without permanent damage. By spring, both children were running across the greening prairie as if the winter had never happened. Alma proved up on her claim in 1892, 5 years after Eric's death, as the law required. She had lived on the land, improved it, survived 4 more winters in the stone tent she had built when everyone said she would die. The land office clerk who processed her paperwork was the same man who had filed Eric's original claim. He looked at her signature and shook his head. "Most widows sell," he said, "or they go back east. I don't think I've ever seen one prove up alone." "I wasn't alone," Alma said. "I had my children." She did not mention the stone. She did not need to. Alma Lindqvist never remarried. She raised Britta and Anders on that land, in that cabin, with the stone enclosure still standing in the corner where she had built it. Britta married a farmer from the next county in 1901 and moved away, but she visited every winter, sleeping in the stone tent with her mother, as she had slept there as a child. Anders took over the homestead in 1908. After Alma's health began to fail, her back had never fully recovered from those weeks of hauling stone, and he kept the stone tent intact even after he built a new house with proper insulation and a modern stove. Alma Lindqvist died in December of 1911, age 53. She died in the stone tent, wrapped in quilts, near the warmth of the walls she had built with her own hands 23 winters earlier. Her children found her there in the morning, peaceful and still, with one hand resting against the fieldstone, as if she were checking the temperature one last time. January 12th, 1888. 44 degrees at noon, 42 degrees below zero by dawn. The temperature fell 60 degrees in 6 hours, and across the northern plains, 235 people died. Niels Torkelson had looked at a widow with 2 children, a cabin with a broken fireplace, and a woodpile that held a quarter cord, and he had told her the truth as he understood it. A woman alone can't cut enough timber and tend children and keep a garden. You'd best find a husband or head back to wherever you came from before you get those kids killed. He was not wrong about the math. He was wrong about the woman. Alma Lindqvist did not find a husband. She did not go back. She hauled 2,000 pounds of fieldstone from a creek bed half a mile away, mixed mortar with her bare hands until her knuckles bled, and built a room inside her room, 64 square feet of rock and mud, insulated with hay, heated by a fireplace that everyone said could not keep her alive. On the worst night in Dakota Territory history, while farmers froze 12 feet from their own doors and teachers lost their students in the snow, Alma Lindqvist sat in her stone tent with her sick son in her arms and watched the walls hold back the cold. The cabin is gone now, collapsed decades ago, returned to the prairie it was built on. But if you walk the old Lindqvist homestead in Minor County out past the marker where Eric is buried, you can still find them, round river rocks scattered in the grass, half buried in the earth, carried half a mile by a woman who refused to die.